To let's talk about worship. I appreciate it very much. You're welcome to move up closer if you feel so moved. I know that I don't really like people telling me where to sit, so I'm not going to be real bossy about that, but if you'd like to form a little more community up front, that'll be nice. But meanwhile, I'll move out toward where you are, and then we'll kind of meet in the middle here, so feel free to move around if you choose. The idea of this first session, Curator or Explorer, came from somewhere in an article I read recently. Somebody asked the question, is Curator enough for a worship model, and should Explorer be in the part of that? And I'm sorry that I'm not giving credit to who said that, because I couldn't remember where it was, and I did a lot of Googling. Some of you probably Google it during this session and find it, but I couldn't find where I read that quote or read that question, and then it kind of got me thinking about that. But the whole idea of Curator comes from a couple of books that have been published in the last few years. One is called The Art of Curating Worship, which is a very good book, and the other is called Curating Worship. So both of these books have been kind of where that whole idea has come from, with the idea of worship curation. That is an idea that's being tossed around a lot in some circles and not at all in some others. So if you haven't heard that very much, then you're not left out. It's just not broad in some places, and it hasn't been talked about very much at all in some places. But I thought it would be helpful for us to talk, to start out this afternoon, to say, ask this question: what one word best encapsulates your vision, your mission, your responsibility, your calling, your goals as a person ministering through music? So why don't you think about that for a second, and I would, if you don't mind, I'd like you just to kind of talk among yourselves for just a minute or two here, and talk to somebody about what title, what would really give you, what would roll all of the stuff you do, how could you be titled in a way that really says who you are and what you do? Because a lot of times I think we find ourselves saying, well, my title is whatever, and then we say that, it's not really what I do, it's not really who I am, and it's just what they give me, and we find ourselves defending our, whatever, or taking apart or dissecting that. So why don't you think about that for a second and maybe talk among yourselves for just a moment. So let's start out with that. Okay, as we kind of come back together and talk about that for a moment, what are some of the, without looking on these many titles that I got from some different research, what are some of the titles or some of the ideas that might really be possible good and accurate descriptions of who you are and what you do in your church? What did you come up with? Yes. Okay, worship facilitator. Okay. That's a lot of where we're headed kind of in this session. What else? Okay, okay. Servant? Okay, so music servant or worship servant or servant of...
The idea if worship is not encapsulated somehow in what you are called because what you do, then for me, I just know that this worship is what the bottom line is. That's what we come to.
Okay. So the idea was that worship should somehow be involved in that description. Yes? Okay. Okay. An enabler. All right. Reminder. Okay. We're there to whisper the cues and give people a reminder of what it is and all those things. Yeah. Equipper. Okay. All right. Great. Well, I recently went back to a church that I had left several years before. I was gone from a congregation that I had served for 8 years. I was gone from there for 3.5 years. And then I went back as a minister there, and they gave me a different title when I went back. And my title had been Minister of Music, and I was actually going to look up my title. I don't remember exactly what it is, but it's something like Minister of Worship. I think worship is first, and it may have music in there. I may just say worship. But I keep reminding myself, as every once in a while I think about that title, and I'm reminded that my vision is supposed to be broader. My work is supposed to be broader because of what they have asked me to do, and because of the fact that they changed my title. I was already doing that, I think, and I think I was feeling that that was part of what I should do, but I hadn't been enabled or sent forth to do that. No one had commissioned me to do that. I just did. So I'm a big believer that titles do matter, and I think they do affect how we think about ourselves, and they do affect how we minister, what difference it makes. I had kind of a fun little experience. What are people who facilitate our music and worship most often called? And so this first thing, first of all, the Methodists have done a good job with this. There are a bunch of articles that talk about what Methodists call themselves. And so if you're Methodist, the Methodists are quite interested in what we call ourselves or what other people call ourselves. Other denominations, not so much by any means. There's no paper trail, as it were, or electronic trail about that. But Baptist and Methodist responds to the question, what is the title of the person who makes the majority of the musical decisions for your church? And you can see the different percentages here between Baptist and Methodist. And you can see in some places they're pretty close, in some places not so close at all. Music director being the one that has the most likeness. So you can see that. From another Methodist survey that involved 109 churches, we gleaned the following. So that was quite a chore to type all of that, because you can see there's a whole bunch of differences there. And you can imagine, though, as you read these different titles, you can imagine what the emphasis of that church might be, or how that church might prioritize their worship. And you really do learn, I think, a lot about those congregations by actually just reading the title. So, very interesting stuff, I think. From another survey, what do we call those who lead in weekly worship? And some ideas were presiding minister, assisting manager, liturgist, celebrant, reader, servers, leader, pastor, lector, acolyte, and some of those things. So from this information, we might gather that titles mean a lot, or that they don't mean very much at all. I don't know what you do about those kind of things. And some of you are in very liturgical congregations, and some of us not so much at all. But my idea here, and the point of the article from which that information came, was mostly that we should call people whatever it is they're doing. Like the worships that we did earlier, we simply said reader and congregation. That kind of thing. So trying to be just very specific about what it is we call people. My question is always, if a person who just drops in on a given Sunday wouldn't know what this means, then I should change it. Especially if it doesn't matter. So when I use terms like that, I would have to explain what that means. Sometimes I use that if my parents wouldn't understand it, then maybe I should do something differently. And that's not a put down to my parents. It's just simply saying my parents come from a very one-track kind of background, and they have not worshipped in a lot of other places. So I try to think, are we explaining and are we saying what we really need to say? And simple is always better. Yeah. For instance, little bitty things like I will usually say reader and congregation instead of leader and people in a responsive reading, because we're all a part of the people, for instance. We're all kind of in that group, and I try to make sure that we only designate ourselves as the leader, and then we stay away from titles and lots of things like that. But those are just my feelings, and you don't have to believe that. So, 2 significant books that have brought about this role to the forefront. I mentioned those 2 books, and then you have some information if you want to look at those later. So what is the role of an art gallery curator? As we think about this whole idea of curation, what does that mean? So what does it mean if you're an art gallery curator? We go on to describe that a little bit, but what does that mean, and how might that apply to what we do as worship leader? If you were to be imagining or describing to someone what a curator does in an art gallery or art museum, what kinds of things might a curator do? Yeah, Mark?
Depending on the mission of the gallery.
Okay. It can very much depend on what the mission of this gallery or this museum or this collection is. It would very much depend on that. Yeah. So it would certainly be contextual. But what are some things that person might be responsible for doing? What are some broader things? Caretaker, okay, caring for something and making sure it's preserved and protected and well presented even. What else? Okay, acquiring new things, collecting newer materials, yeah. Which kind of gets into our explorer idea, yeah. And so it kind of depends on where you come from and how you imagine that. What else did you think of? Yeah, okay, all right, so changing them out, yeah. And keeping them moving so people aren't seeing the same thing week to week or ever how often we might imagine, whatever the statistics are. But in our world, it's an every week thing. So our displays need to be moved around quite regularly. Yeah. And how do we present things? I'm a big believer that framing makes all the difference. Have you been to a frame shop lately? Have you bought any work of art or something and taken it to have it framed? I recently went on a trip to Kenya, and I got a little bit carried away, and I bought 2 pieces of art from an artist that I met in Kenya a couple of years ago. And because my students and children call me cheap, I didn't have them rolled up. I brought them back, stretched and everything, because it cost me $75 once to have something stretched again. And so anyway, I brought them back, and then went to Hobby Lobby to have them framed. Well, I stayed at Hobby Lobby about 2 hours trying to figure out what frame will make this art pop, stand out, what will be true to it, what will be true to where it was created, but also connect its creation into the place that it's going to be, which is our home. And how do we make this loop, and how do we connect it with other things, and yet not make it the only African piece in the whole house and make it look odd? You see all those questions that you might ask just about framing something. But when you frame something differently, it changes everything. And then when you get into even things like color and matting and all that, it's a whole other thing. So I often think of worship as framing. How are we framing something? In what context are we framing it? The worship service that we just participated in a little bit ago, have any of you sung the song, Oh Great God, Give Us Rest before today? Has anybody sung that? Yeah, I guess. If you listen to it on YouTube, it sounds quite a lot different. Yeah, if you listen to David Crowder sing it, it has a very different feel. A very good feel, but a different feel. But so what we did today was frame it differently. What about our singing today of Agnus Dei? Okay. I had not ever done that with brass before, and I decided, because we were recruiting so many people to do so many things, that if I get a bunch of guitars and a drummer and we do all of that, then that's a whole other set of people to rehearse with. And then I thought, well, why shouldn't we just frame it differently today? And what if we just use the brass? And what if we make it all different? And then we let that frame cause this piece to match with these other pieces when they wouldn't necessarily match otherwise. And then we displayed them in a different way and connected them in a different way. And then we use those greetings to connect two other things, and then connect that into the rest idea, and hopefully eventual rest in heaven. And but you see how that all came about as imagining art, and how you would line all this up, and how you could connect to it, not make it look like a preschool display of what is your favorite picture, or something like that. But that whole idea. So curators do all of those kinds of things. How does this description stack up with some of the titles and the implied roles above? So do these roles that we just talked about and the way we describe ourselves, how does this curation idea stack up with that? That's a question we're kind of asking, and the one that we want to think about. Curate comes from the Latin curare, which means to care for. A British website advertising the job of art curator says, a museum or gallery curator acquires, cares for, develops, displays, and interprets a collection of artifacts or works of art in order to inform, educate, and entertain the public. And so that's a description or a definition. So how does this match up with what we do in our place? How does that match up with what you do and how you imagine yourself? I don't really have to answer that question, but I hope that you'll think about it. I'm also a big believer in that the way we imagine ourselves and our roles has everything to do with how we actually carry them out. But I don't know about you, but summertime is a time when I am reimagining my roles. And I'm looking at all the things, not that some of them aren't ongoing in the summertime, but I have a little bit of space sometimes to think about. And I'm imagining, who is it that I need to be? Who is it that I need to be for the church this year? Who is it I need to be for my students? Who is it? What is my role? How can I imagine that? And how can I become the parts of that role that I need to be? I think one way that we learn that is by getting input. We're going to talk about that in a second. But letting other people, who do you see me as? What do you see me needing to do? I had a conversation with a former student last night, and I said, I've never been this age before. And I'm not sure what I am supposed to be doing at this stage. And I need you to think about it and help me decide what do I really need to be? How do I need to be investing in my life? And who do I need to be? And what's the best thing for me to offer at this final stage? It's not final in termination, but a last third in terms of a working career kind of person. Who do I need to be? What do I need to be doing? Okay, moving on. Art is the medium. The question, what do we consider the artifact in the definition above, or the work of art that we use in worship setting? So an answer might be any creation that can be seen, heard, tasted, touched, or smelled can be used in both a gallery setting and a worship setting. So I hope that can even expand a little bit. Something that can be heard, seen, tasted, touched, or smelled. Have you been in an art gallery or any kind of museum that used smell as a part of a display? I was trying to remember if I haven't, I'm not sure. I have, certainly there's the Bob Bullock Museum in Austin. There's a spray of water that hits you somewhere in there. There's different kinds of feel in different ways. But I'm not sure about smell. So smell is very underused or underutilized in worship. It's something we might want to think about. Well, smells are the most emotive of all the senses, and smells make us feel more intensely than any other sense. So all the studies show. Smells are being used a lot these days in marketing, and one of the reasons we don't know that they're being used is because some of the smells that are used in marketing are intentionally smells that our brain smells, but we don't think, oh, I'm smelling whatever. So we could literally be drawn to a display of something and not know it, or being encouraged to leave a restaurant quickly to vacate a table without even knowing that we're smelling something that tells us, get out of here, or things like that. I've heard some stories about some of that. presenting the work, the story of the artist. While a gallery curator presents her collection of art with the intent to educate viewers about a particular artist's life and career, the worship curator uses art to educate worshipers through the story of God. So we are figuring out a way to create a story or an atmosphere so that we can experience and feel the story in its broadest context. So think about that a moment. We're creating an atmosphere or a setting in which we can experience this story in the greatest way possible. Saturday, I did something very odd at this time with the conference coming up, but I took our son's 15, and I went with Isaac to the Drum and Bugle Corps Southwest Championship in San Antonio. And we got back about 2 a.m., and that was pretty stupid for a conference coming up. But we went to the Drum and Bugle Corps contest on Saturday, and I had not been to a Drum and Bugle Corps contest since I was a band director back in the early 80s. So I've watched a few videos, or clips, I should say. But anyway, there was a lot of difference. But what I noticed was that all of these DCI shows, all of these band, Drum and Bugle Corps shows, they were all about sensing something. And there were art pieces, and there were other props and other kinds of things. And it was every single one tried to tell a story, some more effectively than others. But they were all trying to draw us into a narrative. Now, some of us who are older people in the room, in our experience of bands, or drum and bugle corps, things like that, the last thing we thought about when I was a band director in 1981 was telling a story. You know, we were entertaining the crowd, and we were connecting pieces that had no theme, no likeness, no connection, nothing. We just had an opening number, we had this number, and we had a closer, and a drum feature, or something like that. But we didn't think about connection. Okay? For us as people who are academic choral people, we oftentimes think these days about making a concert flow and making it fit and making it tell a story and bringing people along through something. We didn't used to think that way. So you see how story has become so important in our narrative. So what does it say about worship? What kind of story are we weaving? Are we weaving, or are we just juxtaposing? You see the difference? Are we stitching it together? I think in worship, the place where we most often miss out is in between. It's the stitching, it's the connection, it's the pulling one thing together. And that's not really what the session is about. But the worship that we did today, we tried to be intentional about how this connects with this, and starting from here and moving to here instead of abrupt. You can be abrupt, but you must be intentionally abrupt if that's what you're trying to do. And it needs to be purposeful. So that whole idea of weaving the story. Another example, this morning our son was watching television, and I was grabbing something for breakfast, and there was this commercial that came on, and I was intrigued by it because it had very interesting, thoughtful music, and it had some really great visuals. The visuals were wonderful, I thought. And I thought, what is this going to be advertising? See, these days, you have to wait till the end of the advertisement to know what it's advertising, because it isn't related, really. It's about feel and all this kind of stuff. So anyway, went on and on. It seemed like a very long commercial, but it was advertising iPhones. And I don't know if you've seen that, but it has a couple of people dancing, and has a ballet person with the headphones on, it has a cool person, has a kid, doing some stuff, and has some people reflecting, and all sorts of stuff. So Isaac said, that's a great commercial. He said, wow, that's a great commercial. And I said, well, Isaac, what did you like about it? What did you like about it? And he said, it just made me feel so good. And I said, well, how did it make you feel good, Isaac? So I think the dad who's thinking about, what does this have to do with worship? And how does this all, connect? But it was this whole system, and he said, well, because I do that. So when I play basketball, and there's a kid with a basketball, and he said, I listen to headphones. He said, so I do that. I said, so you found yourself in that commercial. That was like you. He said, yeah. He said, it was just so peaceful. Okay. So what does it have to say about worship, and how are we using vignettes and images to create a story? And what at the end you thought, it didn't matter what this was, I would think I want one of those. but the iPhone matched, and you knew it had something to do. I knew kind of where we were headed. Okay, well, an art gallery curator might place high value on entertaining those who come to the show. The worship curator places the highest value on edifying those who come to worship. The curator of worship does not seek to provide entertainment, that delightful escape from present realities. Instead, the curator seeks to provide an opportunity to enter deeply into the reality and the nearness of God. And so my question is then, how do we do that each week? How do we create a place where we can enter into the depth and the newness of God on a weekly basis? And that's not an easy thing. But let's head along and see if we find some answers as we keep going here. What making context and creating meaning. So as a curator, deeper experiences depend on context. So what about denominational context? What about ethnicity? What about economic situation, age, local tradition, cultural identity, all of that? I think that all worship is contextual. All worship needs to be specific to the place where it is being carried out and being offered. So whenever we take a worship experience, just completely, wholeheartedly take it and move it into another place, it doesn't feel right. Have you been in a congregation recently where you said in your own head, I don't think this was this place. I think the person in charge took this from somewhere else and imposed it. I was in a worship service recently where I thought, this looks like, and I felt it filled in the blank because that person had been influenced by this other place, and I don't think it had anything to do with fitting it to the place where it's being offered. That was a long way away from saying it needs to match where you are and not be copied from somewhere else. So how do we do that? How do we know that? And how do we know when it doesn't fit? And sometimes we don't. Sometimes we don't know. But we must figure out that. So all worship is contextual. It must be within that local place and it must fit. The worship that we were part of today. Why did we talk about rest today? And why did we sing about rest? And why did we try to let rest seep into this experience today? I'm tired, and I assume that you might be. To get here, and we're all hurrying to get as much as we can while we're here, and rather than being concerned about restoration and personal healing. So I became convicted that we needed to experience that. Also, we had a service at our church a couple weeks ago, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, that was about rest. And we did some of this stuff, and I got deeply into thinking about rest. And then I don't know if I do a blog once a month for Curator magazine. And I wrote a reflection on that service and how I needed to rest and how I needed to hear that myself. And then I thought, well, maybe you need that, and I certainly need another refresher course. And so we decided to put this whole thing, but it was contextual. It was trying to imagine who's coming to this place and who do we need to be. And I was looking over the list of who's coming, and some of you guys I know very well, and I was thinking, I bet they're really as tired as I am. And we're all about the same age, and I know we're all been doing this a long time. Too long to quit, but we're not done. And trying to imagine all this context and who are we in all these places. Todd, I think you had a question.
You know, I also found that the context of worship, sometimes that context is the physical space that you're in. And there's certain things about the room, the shape, the size, the architecture, the design.
The room will speak louder. You cannot overcome a room, I think. Yeah. The room is. And you can say what you want to say, sing what you want to sing. But if the room is in opposition to the message, we're going to have a session later about everything we do matters, and we're talking a lot about nonverbal communication and things like that. But the room is a primary speaker. The room is. And so worship should fit within a space. It should fit within a space. We can talk a lot about this room, and we may talk about it later, but when you walk into this room, what's the first thing you see? Pipes, different ones of you. Some of you might see that the lights will be quite controversial in here, and some people like them a lot, some people think they're hideous. But they're usually talked about. But you see pipes. So when you see pipes, what do you think about? Church, music. But pipes could mean a lot of things to a lot of other people. We're going to have a session also on power, and we'll talk about pipes then. Pipes and power, and what that means. You don't have pipes unless you're wealthy. And wealth means power. Okay, so the message is huge. We are not poor here. I mean, for instance, you can't get past that. You can sing about the poor, but you know we're not they. Really, in the worldwide sense. Just things that we can't overcome. Yeah. Now, you could be in our church, which is, we can probably maintain the popcorn, and that may be a little bit different. You know, maybe like your church, you have something that's quite tough to maintain sometimes. But a worship curator is a maker of context rather than a presenter of content. Now, that's a huge statement, I think, and one that I've been mulling over quite a bit lately. But many of us, most of us, believe that our role is to present context, our content. That we are just telling what it is. And how many people in your church say, you know, about things like money? If you'll just tell them to give, by golly, they would. You know, all you got to do is just make it known and they'll do it. Well, not so much. Not for younger people especially. But we are a creator of context, often rather than a presenter of content. And I think that's true especially for younger people. Not so much maybe for my age and older. The younger people really are going to feel this message. And when we talk about the nonverbal thing, they're really going to be caught up in the nonverbal. They're really going to be caught up into what they believe is truly authentic. Whatever your content, be it scripture, poems, video, whole list of things, your role as a worship curator is to choose and organize these in a careful way so that something of the reality and story of God is communicated. So when you put all your pieces, here are all the pieces that we have, then what kind of order are you going to put them in? How are you going to situate them in such a way that a story emerges? And that's the way I think of worship planning, is what order do I put these things in, and what is the role of this, and where does this pivot into this, and how does that all fit? I don't know how many of you listen or watch cooking shows. Some of you are already many. I don't know a lot, but I'm a big National Public Radio fan, and I listen in sometimes. I think there's one day a week where they take these 3 ingredients or something that you have in your pantry, and some famous chef tells you how to use those 3 ingredients into something meaningful. Okay. So I think that worship planning is often much more like how I grew up on the farm, about 15 miles or so from town, which in the 60s was a long way from town, and isn't these days. But we cooked at our home by what we had. The question was, what do we have? Then what are we going to cook? Not what shall we cook, and then we go buy it. You see the difference? You cook what you have, and if you have the same thing in your pantry or in your garden, and you keep cooking the same thing, but how many ways can you fix black-eyed peas and still enjoy it in the summertime? Or whatever. And really creative country people can take the same ingredients and just make amazing food out of them time after time by changing. You know, I always say my grandmother had like 6 different kinds of cornbread she made. She always had cornbread, but we never thought of it as the same. Because she shaped it differently, and one had water, and one had milk, and one had eggs, and you know, all kinds of stuff. You see what I'm saying? So worship is about using what you have, but shaping it differently, rather than having the opportunity and the ability to hire whatever it is, or to go out and buy all the pieces, and then put your meal together, if you take a food analogy. And I think that's part of what this curation idea really is. Okay, looking quickly ahead, every curation choice, and you have several of them there, is actually crafted, should be created in a particular context of worship. These choices also create how new meaning as artistic elements that may mean one thing when experienced alone, but can communicate something very different when experienced together. So you can take a song, a scripture, any of the things, and you can put it in a different context, and then suddenly it means something very different, and it takes on a different shape. Love divine all loves excelling, to me, today took on a different shape and a different meaning than it might take had we used it as the first thing in worship. When we said cast our crowns before thee, we were saying, in the bigger context of things, this is where we're going, this is what is going to be happening to us ultimately. But it could have meant, the psalm could have been shaped around the theme of love, and it could have had a whole different ideas, cast in a different context. For most of the worship service, where are we? I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong one. What all this boils down to is that near the top of the worship curator skills list should be the ability to understand one's own cultural context and how to speak well to that context through artistic means. And how do we do this? We know the people. What are the cultural clues that we look for, and how do we know what those are? How subtle or not are people? How do people dress? What is their educational level? What's their background? Where have they been in the past? And then what is our role in that? And our role is to take all those stories and all those contexts and then to put them all together in some meaningful way. And that's what we're doing. So what else makes a curator unique? Unlike the upfront and very visible role of priest, preacher, and performer in music, the curator, if the curator does his or her job well, the leader is often invisible. So how might the leader be invisible? Have you thought of that? After I put this presentation together, I've been thinking a lot about that. How invisible am I? How invisible should I be? Does that mean I'm just not ever on the platform? Or does it mean more than that? Yes?
I think someone said, I try to be a participant, but not necessarily a primary participant. In meetings, it involves other people, discussions, it involves other people. I have a close team on stage that really as much as I am. So I think I'm just one people and not one person.
Okay. Yes? Because in essence, God did, but sometimes we step up and, God would have a hard time getting credit because we've been so visible. Yeah. One of the things when people say, you make this look so easy. A few weeks ago, somebody after church said, this worship really looks easy when you lead it. It just looks so good. I'm sure it must not be always that way. And I'm not sure I'm always at peace put on that. But I took that as a big compliment. I was thankful that if it didn't feel that way, at least it appeared that way. And most of the time it is, most of the time it's true. But ways for us to be minimized so that God can be magnified. One thing today, the person working the sound, I said, I really don't want you to hear me. I said, this group doesn't need to hear me. They can sing. They don't need to be singing out loud. And so those kinds of things where you think about it differently. Who is leading a particular piece? Do you have to be the one conducting it all the time? Do you have to be the one leading it? If it's group led, then let the group become a part of the group and step back away, or middle ground, or all those different kinds of ways that you might do that. But how do we look at this one? I'm challenged by that, actually. And I'm going to be exploring ways to I don't know if I'm going to step out or I'm just going to be out. I don't know what I'm going to do with that. But I'm really challenged to figure out ways to not be the circus ringleader so much. Not be just the one right there in the middle of everything quite so much.
That's something I really noticed in worship here at the I guess my word that I love so much is just singing. And you aren't, you know that you put it together, but it's the intention is everything it goes through. And it just sings, there's not a jump in the sky. And the message comes through more and more each day. It's kind of lays on the trying to do it, and it's not all that.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you so much. Well, in this session, we're going to talk about nonverbal communication. We're going to get into that a bit more and how we might might do that, and how we might be more effectively leading in some of those kinds of ways without saying so much. My role is, can I do a whole worship service and never speak? And then when I do speak, why do I have to speak, and could I have not done that? Doesn't mean that I wouldn't speak, but if I do, I should do it with intentionality, not because I have to hear myself or whatever, or because I didn't plan. We all have those moments where, the only way to get it to work is to say it because, nobody else knows what I'm thinking. That kind of thing. But anyway, those are good things to think about, and I've been challenged by that, very much challenged by that. Well, the performance music leads with a single primary meaning. The curator is a purveyor and promoter of any and all media forms, so that we're not just the one with an instrument, or we're not just the person who have an instrument or whatever, but we're the one that empowers all the different pieces that are around us. And what are all those pieces, and how do we empower them? And how do we entrust, really so many times it comes down, again, to power and control. We don't really trust other people. Did I trust Liv to start the right tempo today? Did I trust the viola player to start the right tempo? And what would I do if she didn't? She plays in our church, and I absolutely trust her. She's so smart and perceptive and so in the moment in worship. And she does know what to do. But how do we do that? How do we trust others without counting her off? And what might have been different had I looked at her and counted her off rather than just let her lead? See, all those kinds of things. If a preacher tells the story of God with words alone, the curator often uses new media, digital fusion of words, images, and sound in a format that invites interactivity. What might this look like? Last year, some of you were here with Leonard Sweet, and he talked a lot about media and how media is integrated and all that kind of stuff. I haven't done very much with that, to be honest, but I've thought about it a lot. And if you don't think about it, you certainly won't ever do anything about it. But I've thought about it a whole lot, and I'm not in a place where we have the option of using a bunch of media, but if I were, what could I do? And how could I do that without media? How could I take the same idea? See, so many times somebody has an idea and we immediately nix that and say, can't do that, I don't have that in my church. Well, how could you take the same idea and infuse it in some way, even with a whole different contextual reality? What might you do for that? For most of worship, priest is positioned to lead from the physical center of a worship space. In contrast, the curator leads the action from the periphery. And how could we do this? How could we lead from the edges? And we talked about this some, but how can we do that? How can we just simply be on the edges? The curator largely organizes and presents the work of others, and in so doing promotes a shared leadership of worship. This approach is not a hallmark of any other historical leaders, save the people of God from the early church. And so in no worship place in history do we really have this model, except just when the people lead from themselves. So it's really, in a sense, a new model. It's a different model than most of us have been trained. And I will tell you, frankly, some people will feel a little bit uncomfortable sometimes when you're not being very verbal and telling them what to do. Particularly, again, I'm not picking on older people, but older people really want you to be very direct and tell them what to do rather than kind of leading them along. Because a lot of times, again, when we're studying the nonverbal stuff, we find that older people are not such astute readers, or not as astute readers of nonverbal communication as younger people. And younger people really, really watch nonverbal communication. And they'll write you off just like that if you kind of look at them in a way that they perceive as not encouraging and that sort of stuff. At least that's true for the children in our home. I don't know about yours. Yes, Mark.
I think, on the other hand, it strikes me that when you talk about the frames, that often in the use of verbal, I find that younger generations need a more verbal frame to why they're doing this, whereas older generations can take the art as it is and don't need the why. Does that make sense? That kind of articulated content. So I would agree with you on nonverbal communication. With the verbal communication, I find that
Yeah, so they may not be as deep into the content and all of the.
They are able to
Yeah.
form the intuitively, that they need to know about.
Well, we may also think about, maybe there's something here about verbal framing also, and how do we do that well? And maybe some of us have been so much not beautiful verbal framing that we kind of reacted in opposition.
I thought this was beautiful today, the way you took out the words from one next one right now and said them back to us again through the years and added scriptural thought. It's beautiful. And to me, that's a beautiful way to bring the poetry of the hymn, the lyrics, back to us again. I so often wish for that in my congregation to lead worship so that they really hear, see, think, feel the words to these hymns. It's so easy to just sing again.
Well, in all those scripture passages, I know about 8 or 9 or something like that. And I just Googled scriptures about rest or something like that, and picked out a bunch of them. But they could have been contextually different, right? We could have talked about creation, we could have talked about great pasture, I don't know, we could talk about any number of things, but set in that rest context, we put them in a different, juxtaposed them, put them in a different way. But interestingly, it would be, you might want to know that I didn't write the prayer that they did at the beginning, the all hail the power and the connection of the confession into that. I sent the 2 students an email and I said, could you all put together a prayer? Here's what I'm imagining. Could you take the text of this and could you do something with this? And Megan last night, she said, well, this worked. And I said, this is great. I love this. It's really, really good. See, the truth is, I don't think I could have done that as well as they did. I really don't. And I was so pleased with what they did with that. But could people in your church do that? So last Sunday, I asked a woman to pray. We only have another person doing this prayers. But new system, she retired, and now it's in the worship team to do this, which I think is going to be better. I enlisted a person to do this, so I said, here is the hymn that precedes your prayer. Here's the text of what follows. Well, she came Sunday with just this amazing prayer. And all I did was say, I thought you might want to know, here's where this fits. And she did it so well. And she didn't go to seminary or anything like that. She just thinks. Yeah. So it doesn't always work. Yes, but sometimes it does beautifully. Let's move on. Considering Explorer as a model, are the implications of Curator adequate as a worship leadership model? How might Explorer expand Curator's implications? And the whole idea of a new song, singing a new song, exploring, going into new territory. Explorer of what would be a question. In what ways is worship leadership similar to guiding people on an expedition to places not yet traveled? I like worship as a travel analogy. I often think of worship as in the context of travel. When, where, how long. Depending on your congregation, you can take them to different places. And depending on the trust level that you have with a congregation, you can take them further and further away from home, and they will trust you to get them back. My rule in worship is you always have to take people home by the end. You never leave them out in the wilderness. And as long as they know that you'll bring them back home. Some people, I learned this with senior adult choirs years ago, but some people will go and spend the night. And there's some people, they will not stay overnight. They will go as far as you can go for a day, but by golly, they're going to be in their bed at nighttime. End of discussion. Okay. And you need to know who these people are in your congregation who, figuratively, will not travel overnight. And they will only go so far. And every once in a while, you can take everybody else and leave them at home, but you can't leave them every week. See, because they're in this congregation too. So, the travel analogy, how fast can you go, how can you travel? See all these questions that you ask if you think of this in an analogous way. In what ways is worship leadership similar to guiding people? We said that already. To take the church into the world, a place where we often find God, a missional place, we must be brave in our leadership and willing to explore yet to be discovered ways of doing things. So how can we be missional? How can we reach into the world? In the book, the new book, From Memory to Imagination, that hope you will pick up a copy of. There's a whole section, a whole chapter on being missional and how worship, how music can be missional, because I think that's unexplored. And if you ask me how to do that in the local context, I will tell you I'm working on it. Okay? I'm thinking, I'm imagining, I'm trying to think, how do we take worship, how do we take music, really take it into the world in ways other than going to the nursing home and singing in the park once a year. And I mean, that's good. That's a great step. But what's step 2 and step 3? How do we really do it? So we need models for that. But how do we do that? How do we take it into the world? And we have to be brave to do that. In addition to preserving culture, we must also interact with culture as it is happening. Okay, so the interaction. We must go where the people are and interact with them through music and other art forms. And that's a place where I'm not sure that the curator model really quite connects, except that a curator certainly could visit art shows and those kind of things, and places where people are making maybe more grainy kinds of things. But how does that work, and how might it happen? How does the curator model and explorer idea stack up against the maintenance versus missional model? That's a struggle within most of our churches. What roles will we play? How do we move forward? What is the maintenance versus missional model? Have any of your churches had those kind of discussions? Are we maintenance or missional? Okay. All right. Okay. What are maintenance things that churches do? Not that you're not saying this is what my church does, but what are some things that you would put in the category of maintenance? I don't mean fixing the building, I mean like congregation. Could be fixing the building.
Programs, inner focus.
Okay, inner focus, things for us.
Moving into the sacred tradition.
Okay, protecting what is. My example often is redoing the kitchen over and over and over so that we can eat more and make it easier for us instead of doing it for the sake of reaching others and who's going to come in and eat from this place and how much food we're going to send out, whether how much we're going to take here. Things we do only for our own space and only for our own selves. And how much of that do we do? Maintenance versus missional. How much is outreach and how much is reaching others and taking the world? And what do we do about that musically? Sometimes we say, well, there's the rest of the church. There's the rest of the church. No, we're music. We're music and worship. And we stay in this sanctuary, this protected place, which is not a bad word, but it's not the only word. It's not the final word. Stuff to think about. Music and worship leaders must have an entrepreneurial mentality in which we are always reimagining what we do and finding new ways in which to engage further. I think it would be helpful for us sometimes to think about this whole entrepreneurial kind of thing. And how is it that we are reimagining the work of the church, and we're always being, in a sense, an entrepreneurial person. So again, we're going to get through some of this a bit quicker now. How have museums shifted the ways in which they engage with the culture? How have museums become discovery zones and less top-down? What might this imply for the church? And how might their multi-sensory models be helpful? Have you been to a museum lately that was really interactive and multi-sensory? Yeah, the museum here on our campus is quite interactive, especially the children's section, but a lot of it. I went to the Oklahoma City Bombing Museum a few years ago, and it is one of the most interactive places. I lived in Oklahoma at that time, and I stood there and wept because it took me back to that day and that moment and to that experience. I mean, it was so interactive. How many times does church do that for me? And how invested am I in the Christ story, the God story, the God narrative? How invested am I in that? And why would not worship do that for me? Why would it not be an interpreter of that, of my experiences, present, past, future? How has the leadership within museums changed in order to allow for a personal discovery experience? Are there lessons for the church? Do you imagine that museums have gone through transitions where people have thought, I don't guess I've been here anymore. This place has changed. Or have museum people been creative all the time? And how are we to be creative? And how are we to reimagine? It's just something I've been thinking about. Worship leadership involves singing a new song, and we're always expanding forms and genres. While we were building a collection and watching over the past, we were also adding to the church's repertoire and exploring new artists and creations. Always looking for new things. Now, there is a thing about being obsessed with the new, right? That's not healthy. That is absolutely not healthy. But letting the past inform us and being in touch with the past, but also having this turn toward. It's a constant shift, and it's something we have to have others to help us know whether we're being balanced or not. We don't always have to be balanced. That's a misnomer too. Not all of life has to be balanced. Okay. If it is, most of us are in a mess. Because I don't know if you're always balanced or not, but I'm not. Well, the term worship curator or worship explorer might never be anyone's title. They give us new ways to imagine what we do. Memory and imagination have both have a place within the church. Memory is the foundation on which all imagination rests. And I believe that. I believe that memory helps us, launches us into imaginative ways. The book has a lot of stuff about that in it, but I think that we are most creative when we have a strong memory. And people who have a lot to remember can also have a lot to build on. So one of the places is we try to be creative by being new gimmicks and things rather than create a solid foundation, and then that can launch us often into imagination. Getting started. Some things that we might do to start here. One is notice neglected details. Things of hospitality, transitions, lighting, before and after music, temperature, all those kinds of things might help us to be a better worship leader and a better curator, particularly. So what does that mean? What do we mean by hospitality? Whether we're welcoming a stranger, whether people are comfortable, whether they're feeling good about this, whether this is followable, whether they have the tools in their hands, whether they know to use the hymnal, whether they have all the pieces here that they need. Just things like that. Welcoming, all those kinds of things. Promote diversity. How many leaders are we always up front? Where should or could we be in worship? Are we always in this? Get to know artists. Who is presently in your church? How might they contribute? Commission them. Involve others in searches for music and art. But knowing the people in your church, that you can't just know them by what they do today. You can't just say, Cheryl is a retired teacher now, musician in the church. Well, there's more to her than that. She has a past. I know she plays the piano. I've heard her play the piano. I know she dabbles with the organ. I know she can do other things, and I haven't seen Cheryl in 14 years. You see, but as she moved to our congregation, I have some past knowledge about her that it would help me to know who she is. So the more you know about people, you know that he has, whatever. And you know the story, and you can bring forward something from them that you might not know otherwise. So get to know them. How dependent is your congregation on your leadership presence? How can you enlist and empower others in order for you to become more invisible? And that's worth considering. I missed church a few times this summer because I was supposed to be taking some time to be a healthy person instead of being at church every Sunday. And some people were helping me to not be there. But they said it was really different when you're not here. And so I don't know what that means because I wasn't there when I wasn't there. Okay. But they said it was different. And I don't think they meant altogether it was better. I hope that's not what they meant. But what does that mean, and how do we become more invisible in the concept? How do your gestures and your nonverbal communication exhibit a shared leadership style? That's a really big issue and one we're going to talk about. But I think sometimes our nonverbal communication in worship tells people that I want to be all things. Maybe not you, but maybe some people like to lead worship. I intend to be everything here. There's that worship out there. What percentage of you leans toward curator? What percentage of you leans toward discoverer? How might you shift a few percentage points each year to create a better balance? I'm a big believer that we don't have to say, here I am, now I will be here tomorrow. But how might I shift a little bit? About 2 years ago, I was on a church staff, and the church staff decided that there were some things I should do differently. Okay. And I trusted them, even though I was paid. Okay. So my word to them was, if you'll give me a year, I think you'll see some changes. But I can't change for next week and feel authentic about this. And if I can't feel authentic about it, I can't do it. But if you'll give me a year, I think you can see some slow, gradual shifts that will be discernible. So can you do that? And I don't think that's just about worship leadership. I think we find ourselves in those places all throughout our lives. So I like to think that I could move a little bit over a long period of time, and then I could own the change rather than feeling like, oh my gosh, I have to be a person who is all different. And I would encourage you to consider that model. You see, this is probably not for most of us, we're not going to retire next year. We've got a little time. And so how can we change in a longer period of time? The last thing, institutions resemble their leaders. How does your congregation look like you? Is this a healthy resemblance? Why or why not? Are they modeling your best qualities? You see your children and you say, do they look like me? Or do they just simply model all of my negative qualities? What about your church? How does it look like you? And how does it resemble you both positively and not? What parts of you should not be modeled? Okay. And how do you make up for your liabilities? And then my last word here is team. I'm underlined a bunch of times that we have to have a team and not just be about us. Our time is up, and I meant to leave some time for questions, but if you come back for another session, I'll pass it a little faster. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to talk with you individually. I don't want you to miss your Dr. Pepper Flips, because that's probably more the reason you came to this conference than other